Hello and welcome to RachAquarelle. Today I'll be continuing with my holiday winter series that I do every day. I've been working on this starting the day after Thanksgiving, and I'm going to be doing a tutorial every day until Christmas. So today we're going to make this cute little card. It says warm wishes, and then we're going to do a little painting of a person holding out a cup of hot cocoa and some steam coming up out of it. The card that I'm using is 6 inches tall by 4 inches wide. And this template is going to be available for you for free. There's a link in the description of this video that will take you to my Gumroad page. And there you can print off this downloadable template and then either use transfer paper or a light box to transfer this simple drawing and lettering onto your own watercolor paper. I personally tend to use transfer paper, which is also known as carbon paper, and I just place it in between my template and my watercolor paper face down, so the dark side facing down. And then you can just use a little bit of pressure. Usually I just go ahead and trace over it, but you actually wouldn't have to make any marks. All you'd have to do is apply enough pressure. And if you're going to use carbon paper and you're not used to that, just make sure you kind of get used to how much pressure you need to apply. Especially if it's a new sheet of carbon paper, you don't need very much pressure to apply it unless you really want some very dark marks. Now, I took an eraser and kind of lightened up the marks around the letters because I'm going to use this masking fluid, which is Winsor & Newton masking fluid, to go over the lettering. And I want the lettering to show up as white, so I only want the transfer marks only as dark as I need to see in order to kind of trace over them. And I'll be using this applicator to apply my masking fluid over the lettering. And this is something where you can just use this knob to adjust how wide you want the application to be. And then you can kind of see here that this just holds the masking fluid in between these prongs, and then when you apply it to the paper, it releases some of the masking fluid. So this is a really good way to have a little bit more control over the way that you apply masking fluid. Otherwise, I typically use silicone applicators, and all of these materials are also linked in the descriptions of all of my videos. They're not affiliate links or sponsored in any way. It's just the materials that I happen to use, and I tend to buy my art supplies either from Amazon or from Jerry's Artorama. I usually just do a little price comparison to see where I can get the better deal. Sometimes it just depends on the day. Alright, so I've applied the masking fluid over the warm wishes. It's not super precise because although I want that area to remain white, I can still go in with a fine pen and just kind of doodle in the letters. So I didn't need the masking fluid to be overly precise on the letters. It was kind of hard because they're so, squiggly and almost like a handwritten decorative font. So don't worry if you can't use the masking fluid to go over the lettering in an exact way. I'm going to keep the colors very simple for this little card. I'm starting out with my Purell Red, and I think for the most part I'm going to stick with Purell Red and Payne's Gray for this composition. Sometimes I think, even though I tend to use limited palettes, sometimes it's good to limit it even more and maybe just go with about maybe just 2 colors. And if you need another color, like for example, when I paint the hot cocoa portion of this card, which is a very small piece of this entire composition, I don't necessarily want to use these colors for that, so I will use, I think I used my raw sienna for that and maybe a little bit of sepia. So I'm just going to go over the mug with an initial wash. This mug isn't going to be anything super detailed. I'll do just a little bit of modeling on it just to give it the tiniest bit of dimension, but it's really not going to be any big deal. And then I'll use the red down here in these sleeves. And I drew those to kind of look like sweater sleeves. Again, just a very basic wash. I'm not worried too much about keeping everything super even. I tend to like things to look a bit imperfect anyway. And now I'm mixing in just a little bit of Payne's Gray to darken that up, but I don't want it to be super pigmented, so I'm going to be adding quite a bit of water to it. Moving on to a slightly smaller brush, and I'm going to do the back rim of this mug. I'm just adding a little bit of shadow under the lip of the mug. I really don't have any kind of photo reference that I'm looking at to do any of this, so I'm just gonna wing it and just keep it very, very simple. Sometimes I think, you can just make things up as you go as long as you commit to keeping it very simple and not trying to go overboard or imagine how you think it should look. Now I'm just adding a little bit of shadow to the handle. I'm almost out of Payne's Gray. This is pretty much going to use up all my Payne's Gray, and I'm almost debating, like, should I replenish it? I've gone through so much Payne's Gray over the last couple of days alone because it's just, I don't know, I guess it's my new favorite color. I seem to find use for it in everything that I do. And even though I've been working in this really limited palette, which consists mostly of that Hansa Yellow, Pyrrole Red, and Payne's Gray, out of those three colors, I still use Payne's Gray the most. So I know that I'll be having to buy a new tube of Payne's Gray before I have to buy anything else. So I'm just going to get a really big tube of it, I think. And again, just kind of adding a little bit of dimension, adding some darker colors where the mug meets the hands or the mittens, because there's going to be just a little bit of shadow between those points of contact. And I want to keep that back side of the mug a little bit less saturated because I want the effect of steam coming out. And I'm not going to use any masking fluid to achieve that, so I just need to be a little bit more purposeful and intentional with my colors. So I'm going to try not to do too much more with that back edge of the mug and kind of just keep the front side of the mug a little bit more saturated so that there's a little bit of distinction. Usually it's my dogs making noise in the background, and one of them just snored actually, but usually they're making noise in the background, but I think today my microphone might be picking up on my cat. She's being very needy right now. It's late at night, so I guess it's her time. Okay, so for this candy cane, I'm going to keep it really simple. I probably didn't need to try to get so many stripes in here as I did try to do. So I just kind of gave it a very light outline with that mix of Payne's Gray and Pyrrole Red, just to outline it a little bit. And then I went in to kind of start blocking in the stripes just with the Pyrrole Red. And I will have to go in with some white gouache at the very end, just because I tried to make the stripes a little bit bolder a little bit later on in this process, and then I kind of merged a bunch of them together. So that happens. It's always good to have a little white gouache handy if you can. I find that I don't do much painting with gouache. I end up kind of just using it to fix mistakes. Okay, so this is a little bit of my sepia and my raw sienna, I think it is. Yeah, it should be raw sienna. Just trying to get a hot cocoa color, which I find a little bit tricky. I was actually drinking hot cocoa today and kind of looking at the color, and it's almost like a grayish brown. It's not the most like obvious color, but I'm just sort of going for more of a chocolatey color here. But it's not even showing that much. It's just like a little sliver of this composition where the hot chocolate is showing, so it's not really that big of a deal. I think if I didn't have the sienna and the sepia, what I would do is kind of mix up an orange, so red and yellow, and then add just a little bit of blue to that just to tone it down a little bit. So if you don't have sienna or sepia, that's what I would recommend doing. And now I'm using that red and Payne's Gray mix, again, just to add a bit of an outline and some of the detail to the sweater sleeves here. Keeping everything very, very simple. And now I'm going back into this Payne's Gray. And I'm going to paint the mittens with just this Payne's Gray. Again, just keeping it very simple, very light. Just kind of covering the whole area, but not really worrying about, you know, doing any kind of modeling at this point, or even, you know, keeping this too terribly even. I should have probably switched over to a slightly larger brush, but sometimes you end up just using whatever happens to be in your hand at the moment and just making it work. Because I tend to do that the opposite direction too. Sometimes I'll have a brush in my hand that's really too big for the job, but I don't realize it until I'm really struggling. There's just a little bit of thumb back there, I think, which could be easy to miss. Alright, so now I'm going to just use that very light Payne's Gray just to kind of mark off where I want the steam to be. And I'm going to leave the steamy part white for now, but it won't be white forever. I'll keep it very light, but just to kind of mark everything off, I'm going to go ahead and go in with just the Payne's Gray along the outside of the steam area and just apply a wash. It's gonna be, this wash will be a little bit darker at the top, and then I want it just to kind of fade as it goes down, because I don't want this whole card just to have a super dark background. I mean, I could do that and that would probably be fine. I just wanted to try to keep it fairly light overall. And I'm using my paper towel here just to kind of soften the edges as I work my way down, so that I can gradually make the background a little bit lighter as it gets closer to the bottom of the card. And then while it's still wet, I want to go in with a lot more pigment up here at the top. And since it's still wet, I should be able to get a nice soft edge as it moves down toward the bottom of the card. And again, just using my paper towel to lightly dab that area to keep it nice and soft. Dogs are snoring again. They're either snoring or they are wrestling with each other. I've got 2 Boston Terriers. So I guess I'll have to settle for the snoring when I want to do voiceovers. And now I'm adding just a little bit of detail and dimension to the mitten areas. So right where the mittens are contacting the mug, I'll make it just a little bit darker and then add some of that texture into the mittens where the elastic should be. The great thing about mittens is that you don't have to paint fingers. And we're actually getting pretty close to the end of this project. So this really was meant to be, it's not a super simple project, but it's also not terribly complex, so it's kind of an intermediate project. And because we don't have different iterations of like masking fluid and applying washes and having to wait for things to dry constantly, this is a good project to do just any time that you want to be able to kind of just sit down and work on something and have a result pretty quickly. So I'm applying a light wash of the Payne's Gray where the steam is. It looks a little bit dark right now, but I think I'm going to be blotting it up with my paper towel just a little bit. There we go. To kind of soften it up and also lighten it up. And also, you probably know that when watercolor dries, it appears a little bit lighter than it does when it's wet. And I learned recently that it's actually not that it actually gets lighter. It's just that when it's wet and it's shiny, our eyes interpret that as being darker. And then as it dries and becomes more matte and less shiny, less reflective, we interpret that as being lighter in value. So just a fun fact about watercolor, because people say that all the time, that it gets lighter when it dries, but that's not exactly the case. So now I'm going back in with more red on the candy cane, and I kind of went overboard with the stripes. I should have just kept it really, really simple with the stripes. So not a big deal though, because I'm going to use the white gouache just to add a couple little highlights on the mug anyway. So no big deal, just to kind of add a little bit of space in between all those crazy stripes I put on that candy cane. And right now I'm just using my Purell Red to add a little bit more saturation to the mug in a few areas. So now I'm mixing up more of my Payne's Gray and my Purell Red, just I think to add a little bit more dimension and nuance to this color, just kind of darkening up that background toward the top again. And then I cleaned off my brush, and I'm going in with a clean brush just to kind of soften these edges a little bit, bring just a little bit of color down here. The only part that I'm really leaving completely white in this painting is, well, of course, the Warm Wishes lettering, and then the skin that's showing in between the mittens and the sweater. And really, that was just kind of an afterthought. It wasn't really part of my initial design plan, but since I kept the color palette really simple, and we've got a lot of red like in the sweater, I didn't want to paint the skin like pink or something. Like there's just too much color down there already, so just gonna leave that white. And I'll go in over that with my micron pen as well as the Warm Wishes. So now I'm up here just trying to soften the edges a little bit more using just a wet brush with no pigment. And I believe that's basically it for the watercolor portion. I think I'm trying to add just a little bit more saturation right here to the hot cocoa. It's not going to do a whole lot though at this point. And that's fine. I just thought I would try. All right, so I think I will go ahead and clean off my palette. while I'm waiting. Really, I'm kind of waiting to make sure that the steam area around the warm wishes is completely dry before I remove the masking fluid. So just looking for other things that I can fiddle with in the meantime. So I'm just going to use my white gouache here, which was already on my palette. And I'm going to just add a couple of highlights to the rim of the mug and to the handle over here. And then I'll use some just to add a little bit of white back into the candy cane as well. And gouache is supposed to be pretty opaque, but I've found that if I let it dry up on my palette and then I try to reactivate it, it's pretty difficult, if not impossible, to reactivate it with water to the point where it's completely opaque, which kind of stinks. Sorry about my dog snoring. I really try to use up all of my gouache. Like I'll squeeze out just a very, very small amount and try to use it up in one session, but sometimes that doesn't happen. And when I peel up the masking fluid, I just kind of rub gently with my finger until I have enough of it that I can just kind of pull the rest of it off. And I find that that's really the best way to do it whenever possible. Because when you pull it, you're less likely to get tears than if you're accidentally rubbing with your finger more aggressively than you think you are. Okay, so you can kind of see the warm wishes. It's not super, detailed, and so that's why I'm kind of going in with this pen and making the lettering just look a little bit more doodly and precise. Sometimes this is a thing that I'll do and it doesn't work out, but in this case, it worked out pretty well, so I'm pretty happy with it. And then I'm gonna add not an outline to this, but just a little bit of line where I need just a little more contrast. And that is it. So really like how this turned out. It's kind of cute and unique, I think. Very cozy. And I hope that you enjoyed this, and remember you can get the template for free in the link in the description. And I hope that you'll give this a try, and I hope that you guys have a great day. Thank you.